The evening was in full swing at La Maison Royale, an exclusive luxury restaurant known for its elite clientele. The dimly lit chandeliers cast a golden glow, and soft classical music played in the background. It was the kind of place where the ultra-rich dined in peace, away from the prying eyes of the world. Among the many guests that night, a black man in a well-fitted yet simple navy blue suit entered the restaurant. His posture was confident, yet he carried himself with quiet humility. His name was Jonathan Cole, though few in the room would recognize him by face. As he approached the hostess stand, a sharp voice cut through the ambiance. "Are you lost?" Richard, a senior waiter, sneered. He had worked at La Maison Royale for years and prided himself on spotting real customers from the ones who didn't belong. To him, Jonathan looked out of place. No designer labels, no flashy watch, no expensive cologne. "I'm here for a dinner reservation," Jonathan replied calmly, pulling out his phone. Richard barely glanced at him before shaking his head. "We're fully booked. You might want to try somewhere more affordable," he added with a smirk. Jonathan's expression remained neutral. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it before. But before he could respond, a wealthy white couple entered, and Richard immediately turned his attention to them. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, right this way," Richard said, his tone dripping with politeness. Jonathan stepped aside, watching how quickly the waiter had changed his demeanor. He could have easily corrected him, demanded respect, but instead, he decided to wait. Tonight was going to be interesting. Jonathan took a deep breath, deciding not to engage just yet. He had dealt with people like Richard before, judgmental, arrogant, and blinded by their own assumptions. Instead of arguing, he simply stepped aside and waited. A few moments later, the restaurant's assistant manager, Olivia, walked past the front entrance and immediately recognized Jonathan. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Cole, we weren't expecting you tonight," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. Richard furrowed his brows. "Mr. Cole?" He glanced at Jonathan again, this time with a hint of curiosity. "Is there a problem?" Jonathan asked, his voice calm but firm. Olivia quickly turned to Richard, her polite smile faltering. "Why hasn't Mr. Cole been seated yet?" Richard hesitated. He had no idea who Jonathan really was, but the sudden shift in Olivia's demeanor made him uneasy. He didn't have a reservation," Richard stammered. Olivia's face hardened. "Nonsense. Mr. Cole is always welcome here." Before Richard could protest, Olivia personally escorted Jonathan to an exclusive table by the restaurant's grand window overlooking the city skyline, a place typically reserved for the most valued guests. Jonathan sat down, amused by Richard's stunned expression. He could feel the waiter's confusion turning into frustration. As Jonathan picked up the menu, Richard clenched his jaw. Who was this man? And why did Olivia treat him like royalty? Unaware of the storm he had just brought upon himself, Richard straightened his apron. If this guy thought he was special, Richard was going to make sure he regretted dining here tonight. Richard's ego was bruised. He had dismissed Jonathan as some nobody, yet Olivia had treated him like an honored guest. Who was this man? Determined to put Jonathan in his place, Richard approached the table with a forced smile. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his tone laced with fake politeness. Jonathan, fully aware of Richard's attitude, remained calm. He glanced at the menu before saying, "I'll have the chef's special for the evening." Richard scoffed internally. The chef's special was one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. There's no way this guy can afford it. "I'm afraid that dish requires prepayment," Richard said, folding his arms. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Prepayment?" "Yes," Richard lied. "It's a policy for certain guests." Jonathan leaned back in his chair. He had seen this tactic before, an underhanded way to humiliate customers they assumed were broke. Just then, Olivia returned to check on him. "Everything all right, Mr. Cole?" Jonathan glanced at Richard before speaking. "Apparently, your policy requires certain guests to prepay for their meal." Olivia's expression darkened. "Excuse me?" Richard's face turned pale. I was just following." "There is no such policy," Olivia snapped. "Richard, step aside." Jonathan watched with amusement as Richard gritted his teeth and obeyed. The balance of power had already begun to shift. As Olivia placed Jonathan's order without prepayment, Richard stormed off, seething. If he couldn't humiliate this man financially, he would find another way. He smirked. Jonathan Cole wouldn't enjoy this meal for long. Richard's frustration boiled over. Who did this man think he was? Olivia had not only sided with him, but also publicly corrected Richard in front of other staff members. It was humiliating. But Richard wasn't done yet. If he couldn't force Jonathan to leave, he'd make sure this so-called guest would regret ever stepping foot in this restaurant. He pulled aside one of the junior waiters, Ethan, and whispered, "Listen, that guy at table 5, he's trouble. Watch him closely. I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to skip out on the bill." Ethan looked confused. "But Olivia said he's—" "I don't care what Olivia said," Richard snapped. "Just keep an eye on him. Trust me." Richard smirked as he walked away. If Jonathan so much as breathed the wrong way, he'd make a scene big enough for the whole restaurant to witness. Meanwhile, at table 5, Jonathan sat back, calmly observing his surroundings. He had dealt with people like Richard before, men who judged others based on appearances, assuming wealth had a single skin tone or a certain type of suit. He wasn't angry. In fact, he found Richard's behavior amusing. The man had no idea who he was dealing with. As Jonathan sipped his wine, he noticed Ethan glancing at him nervously from a distance. He smiled knowingly. So Richard had his little spies watching him now? Interesting. Just then, his meal arrived, a perfectly cooked filet mignon with a side of truffle mashed potatoes. "Enjoy your meal, sir," Olivia said warmly. "I will," Jonathan replied with a grin. He picked up his fork, knowing full well that tonight was going to get even more interesting. Richard stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching Jonathan like a hawk. He was waiting for a mistake, anything that would justify humiliating him. Then, an idea struck him. If Jonathan couldn't afford to be here, Richard would expose it in front of the entire restaurant. He strode over to the table with a forced smile. Time to put this guest in his place. "Sir," Richard said loudly, making sure people at nearby tables could hear, "I hope you're enjoying your meal. But you see, we have a policy for—" He hesitated, pretending to search for the right words. Jonathan looked up, unbothered. "A policy for what?" Richard gave a sympathetic chuckle. "For customers who may have trouble covering the bill. We sometimes ask for prepayment to avoid any misunderstandings." The restaurant went dead silent. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Are you implying that I can't afford my meal?" "Oh, no," Richard said, still faking politeness. "It's just a standard precaution for—" "For certain guests?" Jonathan interrupted, his tone turning sharp. Murmurs spread across the restaurant. People were beginning to catch on. One of the guests whispered, "Did he just accuse that man of not being able to pay?" Olivia, standing nearby, looked horrified. Jonathan smirked, placing his fork down. He took out his wallet, pulling out a sleek, black Centurion card, the kind of card reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Richard's face drained of color. "Would this be enough for your precaution?" Jonathan asked, holding the card up for everyone to see. The murmurs turned into full-blown whispers. Richard swallowed hard. He had just made a massive mistake. The restaurant had fallen into an awkward silence. All eyes were on Richard, who stood frozen, staring at the Centurion card in Jonathan's hand. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Isn't that an American Express black card? Only billionaires carry those." Richard's smug expression collapsed. His plan to humiliate Jonathan had backfired spectacularly. Before he could stammer out a response, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" A tall, well-dressed man in a navy suit rushed toward the table. His gold name tag read, "Daniel Carter, General Manager." He had noticed the unusual commotion from across the room and immediately sensed trouble. Richard quickly turned to him, his voice shaky. "Sir, I was just—" Daniel ignored him. Instead, he turned directly to Jonathan. "Sir, I sincerely apologize if there was any misunderstanding. Is there anything I can do to make this right?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel. The man looked nervous, and rightfully so. A major scandal was unfolding right in front of him. Richard tried to jump in. "I was only following policy." Daniel shot him a glare. "We don't have a policy like that." The crowd gasped. Richard had been caught lying. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "So, your waiter just made one up on the spot?" Daniel's face turned pale. This was a disaster. Jonathan wasn't just any customer, and soon the entire restaurant would find out exactly who he was. Daniel turned to Richard, his jaw clenched. "You lied about restaurant policy?" Richard swallowed hard, his face draining of color. I just thought, you thought what? That you could humiliate a customer based on your own bias? Daniel's voice was sharp, his patience wearing thin. The restaurant guests were watching intently. Some were even recording on their phones. Jonathan, however, remained calm. He smirked and placed his black card back in his wallet. You're right, Mr. Carter. This is more than just an apology issue. Daniel took a deep breath. Sir, I assure you, our restaurant does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Jonathan chuckled. That's funny, because I own this restaurant. The room went dead silent. Even the sound of silverware clinking stopped. Richard's eyes widened in horror. Daniel's expression twisted in shock. You own this place? Jonathan nodded slowly. In fact, I own several high-end restaurants across the city. I acquired this one 3 months ago. Richard staggered back. His hands were shaking as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. A wealthy customer was one thing, but insulting the CEO? That was career suicide. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice cool but firm. Tell me, Richard, how do you think this is going to end for you? Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because deep down, he already knew his fate was sealed. Richard's face turned pale, sweat forming at his temples. He stammered, I didn't know. I had no idea you were the owner. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. And that's the problem, Richard. You assumed. You judged me before even knowing who I was. The entire restaurant was silent, everyone hanging on to every word. Some whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Jonathan and Richard. Daniel finally found his voice. Mr. Kingston, I sincerely apologize for this situation. This is not how we conduct business here. Jonathan leaned back, tapping his fingers against the table. If that were true, Daniel, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. Richard's breathing grew unsteady. Please, Mr. Kingston, I didn't mean. Jonathan raised a hand, cutting him off. I don't care about your excuses, Richard. The real question is, how many others have you treated this way? Richard's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. I swear this was the first time. A voice interrupted him. That's a lie. Everyone turned as a former waitress stepped forward. She had been watching the entire exchange from the bar. Her name tag read Sophia. I used to work here, she said firmly, locking eyes with Jonathan. Richard has treated people like this before. If someone didn't look rich enough, he'd ignore them. If they looked different, he'd find a way to make them leave. Jonathan's expression hardened. Is that so? Richard's face drained of color. She's lying. Sophia folded her arms. Am I? Because I remember when you told me to keep an eye on black customers as if they were more likely to steal. The crowd gasped. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Now it wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. This was a pattern. And Richard had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. Richard's knees felt weak as the weight of Sophia's words sank in. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder, spreading like wildfire. A few customers pulled out their phones, recording the scene, sensing that something big was happening. Daniel, the restaurant manager, looked horrified. Sophia, why didn't you report this before? Sophia scoffed. I did. You just ignored me. Jonathan's gaze hardened. So, this wasn't just Richard's behavior. It was a failure of leadership. Daniel swallowed hard, his face turning red. Mr. Kingston, please, let's not make a scene. Jonathan let out a sharp laugh. Not make a scene, Daniel. Your employee humiliated me in my own restaurant, and now we find out this is a pattern? You expect me to stay silent? Richard desperately turned to Jonathan. Sir, please, I'll do anything. I'll apologize. Jonathan held up a hand, cutting him off. Tell me something, Richard. If I were just a regular customer, someone without power, would you have apologized? Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jonathan nodded knowingly. Exactly. Your apology isn't about regret, it's about fear. At that moment, a well-dressed black couple stood up from their table. The man, in a sharp navy suit, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. This same waiter ignored us when we walked in. We waited for service for almost 15 minutes before I had to flag him down. His wife shook her head. He only took our order after serving 3 tables that arrived after us. Another voice piped up. Yeah, I've seen it too. A ripple of agreement spread through the room. Customers exchanged knowing looks, sharing their own experiences. The restaurant wasn't just dealing with one man's mistake, it was exposing a culture of discrimination. Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head. This is unacceptable. Richard's hands shook. He could feel his entire world crumbling around him. Jonathan's next words sealed his fate. "I've heard enough. Richard, your warning," turned to Richard. "You're done here. Pack your things and leave." His voice was cold, offering no sympathy. Richard staggered back, his arrogance replaced by fear. "Please, just give me another chance. I didn't mean—" Jonathan raised a hand, cutting him off. "You meant every word, but you didn't think there would be consequences." The room fell silent again as Richard realized he had no allies left. Even his fellow waitstaff, who once followed his lead, looked away, unwilling to defend him. Slowly, he removed his apron, his hands shaking. He placed it on the counter and walked toward the exit, his head hanging low. The same door he had looked down on others for walking through was now the door leading to his own downfall. As he reached the entrance, he paused. A part of him wanted to turn back, to fight, to argue, to lash out. But deep inside he knew he had done this to himself. And so he left, disappearing into the night. But for Jonathan, the real work was just beginning. As Richard disappeared into the night, the tension in the restaurant began to ease. Conversations picked up again, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. People had witnessed something powerful, a man brought down by his own arrogance and prejudice. Jonathan turned to Daniel. "You need to fix the culture in this place. This wasn't just about one waiter. If it happened to me, it's happening to others too." Daniel nodded solemnly. "You're right. I had no idea it had gotten this bad." He turned to his staff, most of whom looked uncomfortable. "Things will change here, immediately." Jonathan wasn't done. He walked toward the young waiter, Jason, the only one who had dared to speak up. "You stood up for what was right," Jonathan said. "That takes courage." Jason swallowed nervously. I couldn't watch it happen." Jonathan smiled. "People like you deserve better." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to Jason. "If you're ever looking for something new, give me a call." Jason's eyes widened as he read the card. CEO, Carter Enterprises. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. He had spoken up for a billionaire, and now that billionaire was offering him an opportunity. The restaurant doors opened, and Jonathan turned to see a group of executives from his company walking in. One of them, a woman in a sleek black dress, approached. "Sir, we've made arrangements for your new dining experience elsewhere." Jonathan smirked. "No need. I think I just helped improve this one." As he turned back to his table, the entire restaurant erupted into applause. Some lessons are learned the hard way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. What would you have done in this situation? Subscribe for more powerful stories that will leave you speechless.